G'day friends, welcome to Action RC. Sometimes better known for being a podcast or for producing race reports, written race reports from around Australia and across the Asia Pacific. But we also like to have a good look at new cars and new products that come to market. And on this occasion, it's a new old car, one of our all-time favourites, the brand new, brand old Schumacher Cougar 2 Works Classic. First came out in 1992, released by Schumacher at the time, in the hyper-competitive two-wheel drive modified days of the late 80s, early 90s, re-released in late 2024 to do battle in vintage racing all around the world. One of our favourite cars of all time, and super excited to get our hands on this bad boy and have a bit of a look at it. As I said, we've done a little bit of race reviews over the last couple of years and a couple of product reviews. This is the first time we've gone to video. So it'll be a learning curve for us, and I hope you'll stick with us over the series. I say series because we're going to bring you 3 different videos on this car. The first, a bit of an introduction to the car, a bit of a look at what's involved, what's in the box, and what are some of the components we're going to add to the kit as we build it. After that, we'll come back in a couple of weeks with our thoughts on the build, how the build went, what we liked about it, what were some of the challenges, some ideas, some tips, as you get to building your own Cougar 2 Works Classic. And finally, we're looking forward to getting this on a racetrack, the kind of conditions where we think it belongs. Outdoors on dirt. Now, I know if you're in the rest of the world outside of Australia, maybe New Zealand, a lot of you won't be running these cars outdoors on dirt. That's where we raced them back in the day, and that's where we'll be racing it this year in 2025. My home club, Chargers RC in Brisbane, Australia, right in the middle of building a brand new racetrack, a brand new vintage-friendly or vintage-specific dirt and clay outdoor racetrack. That track will be up and running in a few weeks' time. We hope to have the Cougar 2 ready to run on that outdoor track at Chargers RC. We hope to be there to be a part of the build as well, but we're super excited about getting it on track. Later in the year, of course, Australia's biggest race meeting, the Vintage Classic, the Vintage Bash 4.0, the 4th edition of this race, expected to attract something like 500 cars. We hope to be there with the Cougar 2 Works Classic. So let's talk a little bit about this car. Came out, as I said, 1992 from Schumacher. It's the third, iteration of the Cougar line of cars, which started with the Top Cat in 1988-89. Ran at the Worlds in Sydney, Australia in 1989. Jamie Booth putting the car into the final. It was a funky car. That front end was unusual, and some places, some kinds of surfaces and racetracks proved to be a little difficult. So by 1990, Schumacher had released the Cougar, an update to the Top Cat that included a more traditional upright front shock tower and shocks, some other minor bits and pieces and changes, although the suspension geometry largely the same. That Cougar proved to be competitive all around the world in Europe and here in Australia, winning the 1991 Australian Championships in the hands of the legendary Darren Campbell. By 1991 World Championship time over in Detroit, and you'll remember that racetrack, that loamy, soft racetrack that changed almost every run, the limitations of the Cougar platform had started to be reached, I suppose, and Schumacher went there with a whole range of different option and prototype parts. A car that turned out to become what we now know as the Cougar 2, the third version of the Cougar platform, if we include the Top Cat as that first version. Australia's own Andy Nelson was there in the mix. Didn't end up being the best race for the team, but the upshot of all of that, the outcome of that race in Detroit and the work that the team got to over that period of time, the Cougar 2 platform. First released in a race spec, in a team spec, in a sport spec, and pretty quickly came to be a favourite car all around the world. Here in Australia, we got our hands on the Cougar 2 first early in 1992 and really started to enjoy racing it. The team, however, continued to develop the platform, looking at different tweaks to suspension geometry, to drivetrain, to gearbox, and this Cougar 2 Works version ended up coming to market, I think it was late 1992. Certainly we had our hands on one in time for the 1993 Australian Championships in January of 1993 down at Illawarra, Australia's biggest RC car race meeting to that point in time. And the changes were, not overly significant, but enough to make a difference. Different rear suspension geometry, different shock absorbers, different drivetrain, and we'll talk a little bit about that, particularly in the build. And of course, the colouring. The Cougar 2 team chassis, or anodised red, gearbox plates by the time we got to the Works, into that lovely Schumacher purple that would hover around Schumacher cars for the next 20 years or more in different forms. The other thing that happened in that same period of time was that the Bosscat, the four-wheel drive, continued to be updated. If you've got some eagle eyes, you might spot the front end of a Bosscat just off screen here to my left. This is the Bosscat Works, the very car that we ran at those 1993 Australian Championships down in Illawarra. We ran it a little bit further into 93 before the arrival of the Cat 2000 late in 1993. This car's been in the hands of a friend, Brett, for the last few years since then, but came back to live at my house a year or two ago with huge thanks to Brett. The Bosscat Works shared some of the same components as the Cougar 2 Works, particularly the rear suspension geometry. I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but the rear suspension geometry, that same purple anodizing that you can see on the gearbox plates here at the back of the car, and otherwise a lot of material and parts and components carried over from the Bosscat. We loved this car in those days, and particularly on rough tracks, on rough and broken and rutted and slippery tracks, as we were certainly racing on in Australia. So the Bosscat Works, the cousin to the Cougar 2 Works. As I said, the car coming to us in late 1992, just in time for the 1993 Australian Championships. We all know that in the last few years, the last 10 or 15 years or so, vintage has exploded, particularly post-COVID. Schumacher, like many other manufacturers, looking to bring some of their cars back to market. We saw the Cougar Classic, we've seen the Top Cat Classic, we've seen a whole range of the four-wheel drive cars as well. The Cougar 2 was the obvious next candidate in the lineup from Schumacher. I was wondering what it might be. Would we go the red anodizing, the classic Cougar 2 team car? I was delighted to hear that Schumacher had gone right to the ultimate expression of the Cougar 2 platform, the Cougar 2 Works. I said when I introduced this car back in December as the car was announced, that it was a time when there was incredible innovation in two-wheel drive, and we could talk about any manufacturer. We could talk about Team Losi, the JRX2 coming out in 88, 89, and developing very quickly through the Pro platform, the Pro SE, into the XX, XXCR by the mid-1990s. You know, we know about the RC10, that six-gear transmission, the original car, the addition of the stealth transmission, and then into the team cars in the 1991, 92 kind of time, World's cars, and then later on into the B2 platform. There was so much innovation. Traxxas, another, the TRX1 coming out in 1991, just in time, or prototypes run at that Worlds in Detroit back in 91, and then to the TRX3 a little bit later on. Schumacher were caught up right in the middle of that, going from that Top Cat to the Cougar platform, the Cougar 2 development, the Cougar 2 Works, all in a really short space of time, in about 3 years. The Cougar 2000 following quickly, coming to market mid-1993. So by the time we got to the end of 93, Schumacher had released the Cougar 2000 and the Cat 2000, and we're onto a whole completely different platform. I hope in another year or two we'll be back looking at a re-release of one of those cars. But this one, the Cougar 2 Works, represents the ultimate in that Cougar lineup of cars that started with the Top Cat in 88, 89, through the Cougar 2, and into this Cougar 2 Works. We're going to switch cameras now and switch views. We're going to take a look inside the Cougar 2 Works box, have a little look at what's in it, and then look a little bit about what parts we might add to the car as we build it, what kinds of electronics. We're super excited to get this car built and on track. Thanks for being with us for this part one of our Cougar 2 Works Classic series. Let's take a look inside the box. So here we are, the Schumacher Cougar 2 Works Classic. The classic old artwork from the original release back in the day, the lovely new paintwork on the kit, and you can tell right away some bits and pieces going on in that kit, the carbon fibre chassis, the very shock absorbers. Interestingly, not going with the coloured springs of the original. You might remember those early 90s coloured springs of the whites, the yellow, the blue, the grey, and so on. Now, a more modern spring to go with it. The classic aero disc wheels, all of these obvious kinds of additions that take us right back to the early days of that car. Take a look over on the back and we get a look inside the body shell, what things look like, the beautiful purple anodizing. The car built for modern electronics with a shorty LiPo holder there. You could also run a stick pack right down the middle, old school style. And some of the option parts that are available. Purple alloy bits and pieces, including the shock seal, housings, sway bars if you're running on high grip tracks. As I said earlier, we'll be running outdoors on dirt, slippery dirt, so not expecting to need those in our conditions. Conversion to a twin bearing front hub carrier. The Cougar going right back, the Cougar 2, right back to the original Top Cat, a single bearing front hub. even the Storm truck having that single bearing front hub, which was interesting. Alloy eccentric bearing housings, a different wing mounting setup, and so on. Some of the option parts, and a world's classic Pro slipper conversion. We'll have a look as we build the car what kind of condition the slipper that comes with the car is built for, but that is an option if you're running super high power or particular difficult conditions. So let's go inside the box. Now, if you've ever built a Schumacher car, the first thing you'll notice is a world of plastic. There's nothing particularly unusual about this. It is the way that Schumacher have set up their cars to be built for years now. What's good about it is that each step relates to a specific bag. So as we go through the build, for step 1, you'll open up bag number 1 and so on. Does mean a lot of plastic, not entirely sustainable. Perhaps I'd like to see Schumacher looking at some different ways of a more sustainable packaging, but nonetheless, it does make the build nice and straightforward. As we open our kit, the first thing we see, these beautiful carbon fibre shock towers. I'm not going to open every bag as we go, but we'll have a little look. Schumacher have traditionally had a pretty high quality carbon fibre, and I'm imagining these components won't be any different. That's the front shock tower right there. A bit hard to tell in the light. We're sitting outside on our front deck at the moment here in Brisbane, Australia. A bit of an overcast day. Don't really have a suitable indoor venue at the moment, so forgive the lighting. That is the front shock towers. And then really it's parts bag. So we've got parts bag C and B, probably parts bag A here. So parts bag A looks like we're going to start with front suspension arms, bumpers, and so on. Look at those. Everyone excited about building this car with those little circlips. I'll give you one tip right off the bat. If you're having trouble fitting the circlips and getting them to stay in place, you can assemble circlip components inside one of these clear plastic bags. So choose one of the bigger ones. You can get the part inside this, perhaps the pivot pin or the shock shaft, whatever it might be, inside the plastic bag. That way, when that circlip pings off and flies off into the world, you don't lose it. It gets captured by the plastic bag. A little tip from back in the day. So that looks like front end parts bag A. Parts bag B, we can straight away see it, those rear suspension arms, rear bulkhead, some of the other components. Looks like drivetrain starting to be assembled. Differential, there's diff rings in there, so that looks like the order of assembly. We're going to go to parts of the transmission and rear suspension in parts bag B. When we get to parts bag C, and that gives us the rest of the transmission. And this, perhaps the component, this is one more that we'll pull out just to have a look at. Perhaps one of the components that many people around the world are super excited about, the alloy roller drive shafts. So Schumacher had been using plastic slider drive shafts, splined plastic slider drive shafts. There were some roller versions around with plastic housings, but by the time of the Cougar 2 and the Bosscat Works, we were into, you can see them there, the little tiny rollers that sit on the end of those pins that slide up and down inside the drive shaft housing. This car coming out of the box with those alloy roller drive shafts, and that is something to be excited about. We've got slipper clutch as well. So Cougar 2 Works slipper clutch looks like a dual pad clutch arrangement. Does probably ship with a fairly large spur gear, so if you're going to be running on some modified motors, that might be okay. If you're going to be running any kind of high turn, spec motors, you might be looking for a smaller spur gear to add. There's rear suspension components there as well in parts bag C. Gets to parts bag D, and I'm guessing we're getting to shock absorbers. It does look like that's the case. There's our O-rings. There's our very shock pistons. So we won't pull those apart, but enables you to set up the shock absorbers with 1, 2, 3, or 4 hole pistons simply by twisting the inside of the piston. There's our springs we spoke about earlier, a black in colour. I think there are a range of optional springs available. Personally, slightly disappointed that we've gone away from the coloured springs of the early 90s, but I might be able to rustle some up to give a go. I think I saw elsewhere in the box, yes, here it is, some alternate shock pistons, and these are some of the shock mouldings. Looks like these shock pistons are fixed, so there's a 2, a 3, or a 4 hole piston. So if you don't want to use those very quick pistons, then you can go for those fixed pistons. A couple of sets of those and the shock seal housings loose in the bag there. I think that might be nearly all of the main build bags. Slipper, clutch, and drivetrain protector dust cover, 2 parts, just as in back in the day, and a full set of fluids. Looks like we're going 550 CTS shock fluids and 400 CTS, so perhaps different front and rear and greases and tools and so on. My recollection from back in the day, and this is stretching my memory, is that it was largely 30 or 35 weight and 3-hole pistons was the setup that we ran. Get to the body shell, and I don't know about you, but certainly for me, from my perspective, one of the best looking body shells of its era, the Cougar 2 body shell. I was not a super fan of the Cougar, the original Cougar body shell, a little bit sharp and angular. I like that the Cougar 2 got a little bit rounded. Still that classic swept rear cab orientation of the two-wheel drive buggies of its day. And then we get to the piece de resistance, the piece that we love to see, that beautiful purple anodized stamped alloy chassis. All the holes in place for drivetrain, suspension, different battery mounting options and so on that we'll get to as we build the car over the next couple of weeks. Beautiful. I'm thinking perhaps a slightly different colour than the original Cougar 2 Works platform. We can compare it to our Boscat Works in a moment. Not a huge difference, but just a slight different colour, I think. Then we get to the classic Schumacher aero disc wheels, the 2-part wheel. The main part, of course, just a standard wheel to have the tyre glued on, and the aero disc. Certainly some people took the advantage of these 2-part wheels to be able to paint the discs different colours. So you could have a red disc or a pink disc or a blue disc to match the body shell of your car. The disc just clips into place, keeps all the dirt out from inside of the wheel. And classic Schumacher mini pin tyres. We'll quickly throw a tyre onto the wheel there. These tyres really designed and built predominantly for the Astro and grass conditions that were dominating racing in the UK, the home of Schumacher, of course. But we did have some success with them on dirt here in Australia. The different compounds that were available, the green of those days was a firmer compound, or the firmest compound that we would run. There was a blue and other compounds, and there was a compound called BIBX. So we did run BIBX dirt on dirt here in Australia for a time with these mini pin tyres. We're talking about that sort of 1992-93 era. The front tyre looks like, again, the classic kind of 2-row Schumacher spike tyre. Not something we would have run on the dirt here in Australia. And to be honest, probably not a tyre that we'll run when we come to test this car over the next few weeks. We'll be sticking with a more classic ribbed front tyre as we would have been used to back in the day, a 4 or 5-row ribbed tyre. And we'll see what we can find around to fit on the front of the car. But certainly the classic kind of Schumacher 2-row spike tyre for the grass and Astro conditions. We're getting close to the end of our box. Sticker sheet, of course, the classic early 90s colours, pink and blue and yellow, and some of the original stickers certainly there on the sheet. Looks like we've got window masks for the body, some Velcro, a little spare bits and pieces, and some more of those shock piston sets. And then our instruction manual. Probably not going to go into too much detail in the instruction manual in this quick preview, but we will just take a little bit of a closer look to see. Looks like a classic kind of Schumacher style, not quite original. It's been updated a little bit in their approach. That's that front suspension, really one of the big shifts from the Cougar to the Cougar 2, that swept front suspension, changing the weight distribution at the front of the car and the suspension geometry. As we suspected, looking at the parts bags, we go through front suspension and then attaching that front suspension to the chassis, those carbon shock towers we looked at a little bit earlier, into servo and steering, and then we turn our attention to the rear of the car, bulkhead, rear suspension arms, all new rear suspension geometry once we got to the Works platform, different from the earlier Cougar 2, Cougar Classic, or the original Cougar and the Top Cat. Then we get to the drivetrain, the ball differential, which would be a standard feature in any Schumacher car of this era. Schumacher, one of the originators, Cecil Schumacher, of the ball differential. We had a chat with Robin Schumacher on our podcast, and if you want to dive into the back episodes, Robin talked a lot about the origins of the ball differential, why it was needed, where it came from, how it was that his father invented that for his own racing back in those days. Here's those beautiful roller drive shafts. As I said, we're not going to stick around here. Drivetrain, one of the things Schumacher have done right from the beginning is these exploded diagrams that give you every component in the car, through to suspension, shock absorbers. There's those very click pistons that we've spoken about a little earlier, how to build and tune. Gear charts, and this is where if you are wanting to run a spec class, a 17.5 or a 21.5 brushless class, you'll need to take close attention here, and probably you'll be looking for, I think perhaps an 86 maybe, or an 89 tooth. 86 will get you down to 6.53. That might be where you need to sort of start looking for an option spur gear. And if you run the Pro transmission, that is an optional front transmission piece, you can get down to an 80 tooth spur, which gets you down to 6.08. That's something to pay attention to if you're wanting to run spec. Rest of the build proceeds as would be expected. Some great track info, settings, information at the back of the book, and a full list of all of the parts, including all of the option parts. Some of those that we looked at on the outside of the box. Some different. There's another look at an extended range of the option parts. TI turnbuckles, alloy front yokes. We didn't see those on the outside of the box. Carpet protectors to go on the top of the shock towers for those of you who are running on carpet racing surfaces. I think those ones for the rear and the front shock tower down here. Alloy pivot blocks as an option. You can really go nuts customizing your Cougar 2 Works Classic. And a bunch of these parts probably fit to an original Cougar 2 as well, although I don't have one on hand to check. Here's our standard kind of setup sheet with the recommended kit settings and a blank sheet on the back that you can photocopy to your heart's content to keep track of the settings that you choose to run. Let's put all this stuff back in the box for now, and then we'll have a little look at one other thing before we wrap up this kind of introduction piece. Get this tidied up a little bit later because we want to get to building. That's the next priority for us with the Cougar 2 Works Classic. So the other question is what electronics to put into this car. If we were going to build an original, we might do things like SCRC cells. Here's some classic Australian Ozcharge matched SCRC cells. I've cut them to saddle pack configuration for the Bosscat. They're really for display, not a functional set of cells anymore. We might go for something like a Novak speed control. A 410 HPC would be the classic speed control from its era. I don't have one of those on hand. I do have a Tempest Pro from a little bit later on. A beautiful Novak orange speed control. Like I said, 410 HPC would be my choice. Perhaps one of the early Tekin models. We'll probably give that a try because we do have in our hands a little peak performance beauty. This one, an 11 quad. And boy, would I be keen to see what the Cougar 2 Works Classic would do with this little peak 11 quad in it. So perhaps that Novak speed control might just get a run for us. We'd be running, of course, by choice, a KO 1001 servo, if that's the option that we had. We don't have one of those options. So we reached out to our good friends at Mark 1, one of Australia's leading providers of electronics, including servos, batteries, and so on. And they've sent us over the very cool, very quick, very powerful, very funky little M1 series servo, if I could even make my fingers work to get this bad boy out. So this is the servo we will be putting into our Cougar 2 Works Classic. Like I said, the KO 1001 would be the servo of choice if we had one on hand to be kind of time specific. But look at that little beauty from Mark 1. The M1 series, the M62 SR, beautiful performance, little micro servo, equally at home in a touring car as it will be in our two-wheel drive buggy. And battery-wise, Mark 1 again coming to the party, and we'll be going with the Shorty LiPo battery pack. This one from their Titanium series, 4800 milliamp hour, plenty of run time. And we'll see how we go in terms of weight and weight distribution. We might need to add a weight plate, a brass plate underneath that battery. But looking forward to getting this Mark 1 4800 Titanium Series HV LiPo into action. So that's what we'll be putting inside ours. We probably will, in the end, go to a brushless setup. Here in Australia, vintage two-wheel drive typically tends to be 21.5 spec brushless. I did track down an old Thunder Power, so we might start with that one before we get something a little bit more contemporary, and we'll track our hands. We get our hands on a brushless speed control of some sort that we'll get into the car as well when the build comes. The other thing I thought I would just quickly do is give you another look at this, one of my all-time favourite cars, the Bosscat, the Schumacher Bosscat, and this in the Bosscat Works specification. It's been on my desk for a couple of years now since it came back home. As I said, Brett had been looking after it for a few years. He ran it a little bit after we'd run it in that early 1993 season. This car replaced by the Cat 2000 in September of 1993. You can see there some of those coloured springs I spoke about earlier, and you can see the original purple anodizing. So it's not too different from the re-release. I think there's just a tiny little difference. Perhaps we'll pull one of these plates off and side by side it with the Cougar 2 Works at the time of the build. So that's the Bosscat Works, the cousin to the Cougar 2 Works, a car that was available in the same time frame, late 1992 and into 1993. Loved this car. Look forward to getting my hands on a Bosscat Works re-release, hint, hint, Schumacher. So friends, that brings us to the end of this introduction, a little look inside the box as we get set to build this Schumacher Cougar 2 Works Classic. Like I said, this is the first of a 3-part video series. We'll come back with a build in a couple of weeks, and then we'll get this bad boy on track where we think it belongs, outdoors on dirt. I know that doesn't make any sense for you in the rest of the world, but here down under, that's how we do it. Quick reminder, this is the 40th anniversary year of the first off-road 10-scale World Championships. Took place all the way back in 1985 in Southern California. This year, the world's back outdoors on dirt, here in Sydney, Australia, down under at Hills RC. Keep an eye on the Facebook details and social media channels for Hills and RC Race Media, bringing you all the coverage of that event. Promises to be amazing. 10-scale outdoors on dirt for the first time since 2017 in China. That just reminds me how much I'm looking forward to getting this car on track in a few weeks' time at Chargers RC. Again, follow Chargers RC or Chargers RC Vintage over on the socials to keep an eye on that track build as it takes shape in the next few weeks. A proper old school style 10-scale off-road dirt racetrack. It's been a delight and an excitement to take a look inside the Schumacher Cougar 2 box. We're looking forward to getting on with the build. Looking forward to having a cousin here for my beautiful Bosscat Works that continues to sit on the shelf and stare at me every day saying, "Rebuild me, Scott, and race me." Thanks for being with us for this first video, first of this 3-part video review. As I said, the first time we've gone video, the first time we've attempted to, so it's a bit of a learning curve for us. I hope you've enjoyed. Please drop any comments or feedback or questions you have about the build process, the car itself, the history of the car, into the comments here on YouTube or over on our social channels. We'd be delighted to either answer, make up an answer, or dig up an answer for you, anything you'd like to know. We're excited to get on with the build, to get this car on the racetrack, and we look forward to being back with you in a few weeks' time. Thanks for hanging out with us. Again, my name's Scott Guy here at Action RC.
All right.